Okay, so so last class period we talked about the commutative property of, and then there was a let's do addition, and then multiplication, right? Okay, and then we talked about the associative property of, and then again, addition, multiplication. Okay, now remember, the key word for associative property is what word? Huh? To group, right? To associate yourself with others, you're going to group yourself with others. So that's the word grouping, to think of grouping. And then commutative, that's where you kind of commute from work to school, school to work, whatever you may do. But it's the same order, correct? Well, not the order, but going from one part to another part and then going backwards is the same thing, correct? All right, so here, remember, the order does not matter. That's what we talked about. Okay, so this has to do with order not mattering, and this has to do with grouping. So when we talked about this, for the commutative property of addition, we said 3 plus 5 is the same as what? 5 plus 3. The order in which you add does not matter. The commutative property of multiplication said that 3 times 5 is the same as what? 5 times 3. And remember, we talked about, we're not going to do it here, but we talked about last class period that there's none for subtraction, nor what? Division. And you saw why. Just go back to the notes and you'll see why that's not true. Then we talked about the associative property of addition. And basically that's where you're going to have three terms. So let's say A plus B plus C, like this. So A plus B plus C. And remember we talked with associative, we talked about grouping, correct? So we're going to group the first two. We'll group the first two terms. And then that's going to be the same as, remember when you rewrite it over here, A, B, and C stay in the same place, correct? So A plus B plus C. But this time, which group do I group together? B plus C. So basically it says that it doesn't matter what group you do first, the answer is going to be the same. A plus B plus C, if you group these two, is the same as grouping these two first. Okay, so the grouping order does not matter. But keep in mind that A, B, C have to be in the same place. And then there's one for the associative property of multiplication. And so the associative property multiplication, the same thing like this. You're going to say A times B times C. And what do you want to group here? Which one do you want to group first? B and C? Okay, let's keep it consistent with the previous one. Let's group the first two first. It doesn't matter. You could do BC first. It does not matter. But if I do AB first, then when I write it here, what group must I do next? B and C. So same thing. The grouping order does not matter. You can group the first two or group the last two. The answer will still be the same. Okay, so that was the commutative properties and the associative properties. Now when we look at some examples with this, so this is going to be on page 599, on page 599. Okay, so in 599, this is number 4, you have negative 2 times x. So that's what you have. The direction says use a commutative property to complete this statement. So you can put something that's blank, and they want you to use what kind of property? Commutative property. Now remember, commutative property says the order does not matter. So you want you to use commutative property here. Now what operation is this? Multiplication. So you want to use a commutative property dealing with multiplication. So negative 2 times x, what do you think is going to go in the blank? X times negative 2. That's what goes in the blank. Just make sure, you see how if you don't put that multiplication symbol, it looks like x subtract 2? All right, so you need to put this multiplication symbol, you need to show it. Or you could have said this, or you could have said x times, since it's negative, you could have just said something like this. X times negative 2 in parentheses. But just make sure your answer, you don't do this. Is this and this the same thing? No. This is x subtract 2. This is x times a what? Negative 2. All right, so don't do that. Okay, so number 8, you have 19 plus 3y equal blank, and again, they want you to use a commutative property. So remember, commutative property, the order does not matter. So 19 plus 3y is the same as what? 3y plus 19. So that's a commutative property. All right, let's look at 10. All right, number 10. Okay, number 10, you have 3 times x times y. What property do you think they're going to ask you to use here? Associative property, because you have 3 things, and you're grouping the last 2. And so they do want you to use an associative property. Now, what operation do you think you're going to use here? Associative property of multiplication, because you see what? Multiplication. 3 times x times y. All right, now what are you going to put in the blank, though? It doesn't matter what you put in the blank. 3 times x in parentheses. So it has to be 3x and y in that order, correct? Okay, because it has to be in the same order as this one. But instead of grouping the last 2, you're going to group the first 2. So it should look like this. So 3 times x times y.
Do you have to use the multiplication sign, or could you just do y at the end of it?
Go ahead, since they do have a multiplication symbol, go ahead and use multiplication symbol. Go and do that. Number 16. Okay, 16. You have 6 plus r plus s. 6 plus r plus s. So again, they want you to use what kind of property do you think? Associative. And this one will be the associative property of what? Addition. Okay, so what's going to go in this blank? Okay, 6 plus r in parentheses grouped, and then plus s, right? There's the answer there. Okay. All right. So that's that first part of what we talked about. Then remember the last thing we talked about last week was also the distributive property. So we start talking about the distributive property. All right, distributive property. And so so if you had something like, and we start out with a simple example, if you had 3 times 2 plus 5, something like that. Now in the worksheet you just turned in, if the direction says use the order of operations, if the direction says use the order of operations, Could you use a distributive property? No. Or distributive property is not part of the order of operations. So if it said use the order of operations, what did you have to do first? Parentheses. 2 plus 5 is 7. So that's 3 times 7. And so that'll be 21. Okay, now we talked about the distributive property also. So you could also get 21 by using distributive property. And so the distributive property basically says that, now remember, it's got to read like 3 times, correct? And then inside the parentheses, you better see either an addition problem or a subtraction problem. So the distributive property only works with addition or subtraction. And so everything in here has to be multiplied by what? 3. So if you need to draw these little arrows like this, draw the arrows. So you're basically saying 3 times 2 plus 3 times what? 5. And 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 5 is 15, and you still get 21. Okay? So that's distributive property. So everything inside the parentheses has to be multiplied by what's on the outside. And so when you look at number 32, you have 7 times A plus B. 7 times A plus B. And normally what you're going to do, especially when we get into the equations sometime next week, probably Tuesday when we start solving equations, you want to get rid of the parentheses. And so if you look at this, I have 7 times A plus B. So I can use a distributive property here to get rid of the parentheses. So the directions usually, in this case, directions will say, use a distributive property to write each expression without parentheses. Now when we get into equations, it's not going to say anything like that. It's just going to say solve. You have to know you have to use what property here? Distributive property. All right, and so the distributive property, if you need to draw the arrows, you're just going to say 7 times what? A plus 7 times what? B. And there's it. That's it. You can't do anything else. You're done. That's the answer. All right. Let's look at 38. 38. You have 3 times 8x minus 1. 3 times 8x minus 1. All right. So let's get rid of the parentheses. We're going to get rid of the parentheses using what property? Distributive property. So you're going to say 3 times what? 8x, and then 3 times what? Negative 1. Now, you can skip the step that I'm about to do, but you don't have to. If you want to skip it, you can. But basically, you're saying 3 times what? 8x minus 3 times what? 1. And what's 3 times 8x? Minus and 3 times 1? 3. And there's your answer. So just keep in mind you can go from here to here. You don't have to write in that next step. So 3 times 8x is 24x, and then minus 3 times 1 is 3. All right, 42. You have negative 3 times z minus y. Negative 3 times z minus y. So again, you're going to use our property. Distributive property. So you're going to say negative 3 times z, and then negative 3 times a negative y. I'm going to just say it as negative y. Now remember, in previous courses, a negative times a positive is a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. All right. So what's going to be the first term of this expression? That's a z. Negative 3z, right? Okay, now what's a negative 3 times a negative y? Positive 3y. All right? So a negative times a negative is a positive. So that's 42. All right, let's look at this one. All right, suppose we had, okay, this will be number 48. 48, we have negative 4 times 4 plus 2p plus 5r, and then plus 16. That's what we have. Okay, same thing as before. So everything inside the parentheses has to be multiplied by what? Negative 4. So negative 4 times 4, negative 4 times a positive 2p, negative 4 times a positive 5r. Okay? Now, do I also say negative 4 times the 16? No. Negative 4 is only being multiplied by whatever's inside the parentheses. Okay, so let's work on this. What's negative 4 times 4? Negative 16, right? Okay. What's negative 4 times a positive 2p? Negative 8p. What's a negative 4 times a positive 5r? Negative 20r, and then plus 16. Just write it down, correct? All right. Now, what do you notice about a negative 16 and a positive 16? What are those? Yeah, they add up to be what number, though? 0. So a negative 16 and a positive 16 is 0, so your answer is just what? Subtract 20r. Is that correct? All right. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. Now let's look at this example before we do the next one. I'm gonna write it like this. So in the previous two examples, number 42 and 48, you had a negative you had to distribute, correct? Okay. So let's suppose we had this: negative 1 times 3x minus 2y plus 6. Negative 1 times 3x plus 2y plus 6. So what are you going to do? Distribute the negative 1, right? So everything in here has to be multiplied by what? Negative 1. So negative 1 times 3x. Negative 1 times a negative 2y. Positive 2y. Okay, and negative 1 times a positive 6. Negative 6. All right. Now, okay, this is going to be number 52. Okay, that's what it looks like. That's a cube. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Say it again?
6R is the back.
Yes, 6r. All right, what do you think you can distribute?
-1.
All right, so if there's no number there, see how right here we had a negative 4 right here? You could see it, right? And then right here there was a negative 1. If there's no number, if you don't see it, it's understood to be a 1. So that right here is understood to be a negative 1. So you distribute a negative 1 through here. So if I distribute a negative 1, what's the answer? Plus 2, right? And then what? Minus 6r. Okay? All right, 56. All right, 56. All right, 56, you have negative 1/5 times 10a minus 25b. What are you going to distribute? Negative 1/5. All right, so you can say negative 1/5 times 10a plus a negative 1/5 times a negative 25b. All right, now you got to remember how to deal with fractions. If I had, from a previous course, if you have 2/5, let's say, times 15. 2/5 times 15. How did you deal with this in a previous course? Say it again.
Multiply the numerators.
Okay, so one approach is to multiply the numerators first, then multiply the denominators. And remember, 15, same thing as saying 15 divided by 1, right? And so one approach is to multiply the numerators together. Make sure you get the worksheets from Canvas.
Yes, sir.
Divided by 5. And so what's 30 divided by 5? You got to reduce at the end, correct? So you multiply first, then you reduce. And so it gets 6, is that correct? Or you could have done this. All right, this is 15 over 1. Or you could have done what first? Reduce first. You could have reduced first. 5 into 5 is 1. 5 and 15 is 3. And then multiply. 2 times 3 is 6. 1 times 1 is 1. And you get what? 6. All right. So that's review from previous course. So we get over here. Now what you may want to do, remember how we kind of skipped some steps here when we did this? We just did in our head. Negative 4 times 4 is negative 16, because that's easy to do. Negative 4 times 2p is a negative 8p. Negative 4 times 5r is a what? Negative 20r. That was easy to do. When you do this with the fractions, you may want to write in the next step. So you may want to say negative 1/5 times what? 10a. And then let's just go ahead and use the fact that a negative times a negative is a what? Positive. So plus 1/5 times what? 25b. All right, so a negative times a negative is a positive. All right, and then just kind of deal with these fractions like we did these. So if you want to go off to the side and kind of think of it this way, negative 1/5 times 10, right? Even though it's 10a, we're just going to say 10 for right now. So write this as 10 over 1. You can multiply first and then reduce, or you can reduce first and then multiply. Does not matter. But what should the answer be for this right here? Negative 2. Okay? 5 into 5 is 1. 5 into 10 is 2. You're left with what? Negative 2. So therefore, negative 1/5 times 10a is what? Negative 2a. That's what you get there. And then over here, if you think about 1/5 times 25, 1/5 times 25, that's really 25 divided by 1. What do you think 1/5 times 25 is? 5. Because 5 into 5 is 1, 5 and 25 is 5. When you multiply the numerators together, and then multiply the denominators together, and then reduce, you are left with 5. But 1/5 times 25b, though, is what? 5b. So what's the answer going to be here? Yeah, and that's it. Now, if you can go from the original problem to the answer, that's fine. But some of you, when you're dealing with fractions, you may want to write out that step. Okay. All right. So that's 56. Let's look at 58. 58. All right, 58, you have, all right, 10 times 4s plus 6. 10 times 4s plus 6, and then you're subtracting 40. Subtracting 40. Okay, so what are you going to do? So what property are you using, though? Tell me the property. Distributive property. So you can say 10 times 4s is 40s. 10 times 6 is 60, right? And then minus 40. Okay, don't leave your answer like this because you know you can combine these constants. What's going to be the answer?
40s plus 20.
Plus 20. That's good. All right, 40s plus 20. 60 subtract 40 is 20. Okay, write this example. Suppose we had 1/8, negative 1/8, put negative 1/8, times 24 plus 16x. Negative 1/8 times 24 plus 16x. So again, we're dealing with a fraction. If you have to write in that next step, write it in. So you would say, now what property am I using? Distributive. So you say negative 1/8 times a 24. And then a negative times a negative is a I'm sorry, a negative times a positive is a, so you say minus 1/8 times what? 16x? Okay. So let's kind of figure out what negative 1/8 times 24 is. What do you think it is right away? Negative 3. Because 8 and 8 is 1, 8 and 24 is 3, and you get negative 3. So that's going to be negative 3 right here, right? Okay, now here that's going to be 1/8 times 16x. So let's do 16 for right now. What's 1/8 times 16? Y'all agree it's 2? Okay. But 1/8 times 16x though is what?
Add x, 2x,
2x. So what do you think is going to be the answer here?
negative 3 minus 2x.
Minus 2x. All right, that's good. Okay, any questions? All right, let's look. Yes.
If it always has like a x or a y in this type of equation.
And that's not an equation.
I mean,
Expression. Expression.
Like 16y, we're gonna always divide the 8 into the 16, and then add the x.
Okay.
Y.
All right. So you have to remember. You have to remember some things. If I have 2 times 3 times x, okay. Order of operations, you multiply from left to right. What's 2 times 3?
6.
6 times x is
6x.
6x. All right. So if I have 1/8 times 16 times x, okay, you agree that's 16 over 1. Then it's 6 over 1.
Mhm.
You said divide 8 into 16. Sure, because we're reducing. That's why you can do that. You're reducing. 8 and 8 is 1. 8 and 16 is 2. From a previous course, you know that to multiply fractions, you multiply the numerators together. 1 times 2 is what? 2. 2 times x is what? 2x. Divided by 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. Reduce. What's 2x divided by 1?
So
2x.
once the 8 cancels out, so 1, you don't have to do anything else with it. It's been 7 years. I didn't have to
I understand, but what do you mean do anything with it? You are
The
doing
8
something.
at the bottom. At the,
Okay.
Once that cancels out at the bottom, go down to the 8 right here. Once that x is out, it becomes a 1.
Hmm.
You just leave it alone at the 1, correct?
Yeah, because 1 times 1 times 1 is 1.
So the 8 doesn't go into the x, or it doesn't multiply.
No, no, it's kind of like if you had this. If you had 2/3 times 1/4 times 6/5, okay? From a previous course, how'd you reduce this? Okay, guys, how'd y'all do that? The 2 and the 4. 2 and the 2 is 1 time. 2 and the 4 is what? 2. What else can you reduce? The 3 and the 6. 3 and the 3 is 1. 3 and the 6 is 2. What else can I reduce? Nothing. Then what is the next step? Multiply the numerators together. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times 2 times 5 is 10. Now, we said we can't reduce anything else, right? Because I wasn't really looking very carefully, but we could have, correct? The 2's. But you could have multiplied now and then reduce again. What do these 2 and the 10 have in common? Be careful. What do they have in common? 2. 2. 2 and a 2 is 1. 2 and a 5 is, 2 and a 10 is 5, so you get 1/5. So let me just say this, and some of you are in here for, it's been a while. If you having trouble with some of these little concepts, like when you go through, and you will, all of you will, go and Google some stuff. Look for videos. Now, I don't have videos on this. I don't have videos on those prerequisite skills. I have videos on the new stuff, the stuff we're covering. So just go and kind of Google stuff. Google multiply and reducing fractions. That's what we're doing, right? Multiply reducing fractions.
I struggle with fractions.
Yeah, most people
Always
do.
have.
Most people do. But you got to get over it as best you can. And when you get into college algebra, there's a lot of fractions in college algebra. You deal with it. You'll be fine. Okay. All right. So that was that example. Okay, now 62, we're going to use a calculator with this one. So take your calculator out. Negative 0.6, you have a decimal, so I'm just going to use a calculator with a decimal. Times 2x plus 1, and then minus 0.1. Okay, so you need to get rid of the parentheses, so you can distribute what number inside the parentheses? Negative 0.6. So remember though, a negative times a positive is a negative. But you are multiplying 0.6, right? Times 2. What's 0.6 times 2? 1.2. You can see it, 1.2. But this is negative 0.6 times 2x. So it's negative 0.6 times 2x, though. Negative 1.2x, because a negative times a positive is a negative. And the next one you don't need your calculator with, because anything times 1 is itself. So it's a negative 0.6 times a positive 1. Negative 0.6. So when I distribute the negative 0.6, this is what I got. But I also got to remember I'm doing what? Subtracting 0.1, correct? All right. Now you can combine those constants. Use your calculator this, because most of you probably forgot how to deal with signed numbers last semester. So last semester, remember when you add two negatives, you add their absolute value and keep the sign. When you add two negatives, when you add two numbers whose signs are different, you subtract them. Remember all those rules? You probably forgot all those rules. You have access to a calculator, use it. How are you going to put this into your calculator, though? Negative 0.6. Where's your negative button on here? Is this your negative button I'm pointing to? No, that's your subtraction button. Your negative button is right here, right? Right here. So you're going to say negative 0.6. Now, if you have this kind of calculator, you just punch it in as you see it. So negative 0.6 minus what? 0.1? Y'all agree? No? What's wrong? Oh, yeah, okay. It says 0.1 is the same thing as what? 0.1. 0.1 is the same thing as 0.1. So I can go back and put 0.1. It'll still be the same answer, though. And what does that equal? Negative 0.7. Is that what you got? Negative 0.7, right? Okay. So yes, it would be negative 1.2x minus 0.7 or minus 0.7, right? Okay, so that was 40. That was 62. All right. So with the decimal, just use your calculator. Okay, now let's go back to this right here, because you're going to see this on the worksheet on my math lab. So I'm going to go back to number 18, and the directions. Let me go ahead and write the directions out. The direction says use the commutative and associative property. Use the commutative and associative properties to simplify each expression. So you can use the commutative and associative property to simplify each expression. Now, you got to remember what the word simplify means, and depending on the context, simplify can mean different things as you go through the scores. Same thing next semester, same thing the semester after that. So it means different things depending on what you have. So if I say simplify 3 plus 6, that makes it look a little bit simpler in this case. So simplify here means to do what to those two things? Add them up, and so will the answer be? 9. Simplify, that means to do what? Reduce. That's what simplify means in that case. So you need to know that depending on the context, simplify can mean different things. So simplify here means to reduce. And when I reduce this, what's the answer? 2/5. So that will be the simplification of this. Okay? So keep in mind what we mean by simplify. All right, so number 18, you have this. You have R plus 3 plus 11. And they want you to use commutative and associative property to simplify this. Now, you could look at this and tell me what the answer is. What's the answer if I say simplify this? R what? R plus 14, right? Okay, so that will be the answer. Now, what they want you to do, though, is to actually use these properties, show them. So on the worksheet, and I think there's something like this on there, don't just come up with the answer, because I don't know if you really use those two properties at all. So here's the work I need for you to show. A while ago, we talked about the commutative and associative properties. Which property do you think is going to apply here? Associative. All right, that's the first thing I would have thought of, because there are three things, and you're doing what? Grouping. Associative property. Well, they grouped the first two. What do you think you might want to do? Group the second two. So you'd say R plus, and then 3 plus what? 11. And then think about the order of operations. Order of operations. So going from here to here, I use the associative property, correct? And now I'm going to use the order of operations. What does the order of operations tell us to do? Parentheses first. What's 3 plus 11? And so the answer then is what? R plus 14. So there's your answer. So on the worksheet, just don't go from here to here to the answer here, because I need to actually see that you did use a property. And so you got to show this right here. So make a note of that. Make sure you see this. You got to show this. You got to show that you're using, in this case, what property? The associative property. Okay, so number 24, you have 7 plus x plus 4. All right, now that's going to be a little bit trickier. This will be trickier, and you'll see why in a little while. Okay, so again, just like number 18, you would think, well, I'm going to just go ahead and use what property? The associative property. Okay, let's see if that's going to help us. So remember, we want to group things so that we can simplify it. Remember, the whole idea is to simplify. Now, you know what the answer is. What should the answer be? X plus 11. All right, you knew that. All right, you knew the answer should be x plus 11, but follow directions. Directions says they want you to use one of these properties, or you may have to use both. Okay, so I want you to see something. If you use the associative property and you group the first two instead, which mathematically is correct, there's nothing wrong with that. Is that going to help you, though? No. Because the order of operations says I got to add 7 plus x, but I can't add 7 plus x. So using the associative property right away does not help. This is not going to help me. Does not help. All right, so I want you to think about this. All right, if I can't use the associative property, then I'm going to use what? Commutative property. And remember, the commutative property says I do what? Change the order, right? All right, look at what's inside the parentheses. What do you see inside the parentheses? All right, x plus 4 is the same as what? 4 plus x. So I'm going to go from here to here. I'm going to use the commutative property. So I'm going to say 7 plus and then 4 plus x, right? Now can I use the associative property? In other words, can I group the first two terms here? Yes. So now going from here to here and use the associative property. You're going to say in parentheses 7 plus 4 and then plus what? X. And then 7 plus 4 is 11. So your answer will either be 11 plus x, or you could say what? X plus 11. Does not matter. All right, but this is what you have to show. You have to show this right here. Okay? So there's something like that on on the worksheet, just remember you got to show that kind of work. All right, so that one's a little tricky because you have to use both of them. All right, let's look at 22. 22. All right, in 22, you have 1/8 times 8z. 1/8 times 8z. What property might help right away? Oh, no, but someone said distributive property. The distributive property, it looks like, and students get confused there, it looks like you could use a distributive property, right? Because of the way it looks. But the distributive property only applies if what's inside that parentheses. I said it earlier. Addition or subtraction. That's not addition or subtraction, that's what? Multiplication. So the distributive property does not apply there. I want you to think about this. If I have 2 times 3 times 4, okay? Don't say the distributive property. Don't say 2 times 3 and then what? 2 times 4. That's incorrect because you know the answer is going to be 3 times 4, which is what? 12, and 12 times 2 is 24. If you distribute wrongly, you're saying 6 times 8, which is, when we bring out the times tables, 48. So the distributive property does not apply when what operates inside the parentheses? Multiplication. It's got to be what operation? Addition or subtraction. So no, the distributive property does not apply here. In fact, they want you to use which two properties? Commutative or associative. That's what they want you to use. So, which property do you think you'd use first? Associative. No, not commutative. What order would you change? If you look at parentheses, you have 8z. Well, the commutative property says the same thing as z8, but writing it as z times 8 is not going to help. So what you want to do, instead of grouping the last two, you're going to group what? The first two. So you're going to say 1/8 times what? 8 times z. And we just talked about 1/8 times 8. What's 1/8 times 8? Huh? Okay. Now you know what to do. Okay, what's 1/8 times 8? 1. So that's 1 times z, which is just what? Z. There's your answer. The answer is just z. Okay? So you have to use the associative property. So instead of associating the last two, you're going to associate the first two. And then 1/8 times 8 is just 1. 1/8 of 8 is 1. You see that because that's really 8 over 8, which is what? 1. And so 1 times z is just z. Let's look at 30. Number 30. Number 30, you have negative 1/3 times 7 x. Negative 1/3 times 7x. All right. So they want you to use the commutative or associative property, or you may need to use both. But what do you want to try first? The associative. So instead of grouping the last two, I'm going to group what? The first two. So that'll be negative 1/3 times 7, correct? Times what? X. All right, let's think about negative 1/3 times 7. What is negative 1/3 times 7 over 1 the same as? Negative 7/3. Can I reduce this? Can I simplify this? No. So the answer then is just what? Negative 7/3 x, just like this. That's the answer. All right, and so remember we use the associative property here, going from here to here. What's the associative property? Okay. All right, now let's look at this. Okay. So this is number 64, and you're given this. All right, this is what you're given. Okay, that's what it looks like. So when you look at it, it says it says 14 times z plus 14 times 5, right? And so, okay. So what I want you, directions here says use the distributive property to write each sum as a product. Use the distributive property to write each sum as a product. So a while ago you had this. Let me get a simple one that we did. Page 2. All right. So a while ago you had something like this. See right here? And you used distributive property, correct? And then when we wrote it, I actually wrote it out for you. I said that's 3 times 8x minus what? 3 times 1. Okay? What they want you to do now is to go backwards. So they want you to rewrite these right here as a product. So you have to factor out what those two terms had in common. All right, so basically you're going to go here and you can look at this. Look at these two terms here. What number do you see they have in common? 14. So if you're going to use the distributive property, remember distributive property, you think of those arrows. So what's going to go out in front of that parentheses right here? 14. And what's going to be inside? C plus 5. All right, that's all it is. So you're in your mind, you're saying, well, that's 14 times z is 14z. 14 times 5 is 14 times 5, right? So that's the answer. That's all I want you to do. 68. You have negative 3 times a plus negative 3 times y. What do they have in common? So how are you going to write the answer? How are you going to write it using distributive property? A plus y. It kind of makes sense because if you use a distributive property, negative 3 times a is this right here, right? And then negative 3 times y is this right here. Okay? So that's your answer. All right, now 72. Okay, 72. This is what they have. They have 4 times 3 plus 8 equals 4 times 3 plus 4 times 8. And here are the directions. So this set, the directions will be this. Name the property illustrated by each statement. Name the property illustrated by each statement. Okay, so name the property illustrated by each statement. So what property is this? What property? Say it. Distributive property. Here's your answer. Okay, 74. 74. What's this one? Now make sure with commutative and associative, just don't say commutative. Say commutative property of addition, commutative property of multiplication, associative property of addition, or associative property of multiplication. All right, so use the whole phrase. So what property am I illustrating here? Looks like this. What's this one? The associative property of multiplication. Just don't put associative property, right? If you do that, you can be upset with me. All right. All right, 74. Okay, let's look at 80. At 80. We have A plus 9, that's a 9, and that's an A, plus 6 equal A plus, and then 9 plus 6, like this. What property is this? The associative property of what? Addition. Okay. 82. Suppose you had 11 plus R plus 8 equal R plus 11 plus 8. Look at it first before you blurt out anything. What do you think that one is? Associative property of addition? Okay, you think it's associative property. Remember, associative property means to regroup. Am I regrouping anything? No, I'm not regrouping anything. Those, listen carefully, those groups are the same. 11 plus R is the same as what? That's 11. R plus what? 11. Have I regrouped? No. So that's not the associative property. In fact, if you look at what's in parentheses, all I did was change the order. That's commutative property. Commutative property of what? Addition. R plus 11 plus R is the same as what? R plus 11. So commutative property of addition. All right, now this is going to be number 76. Okay, so this is a little bit tricky. 1 times 9 is equal to 9. Let me kind of do this in a little while. There's a couple more properties I forgot to talk about before we do this one. All right, let's talk about this before we get to this. We'll come back to this one. So we talked about 3 properties. So far we talked about the commutative properties and the associative properties and distributive, right? Okay, so here's some others. We're going to come back to this one in a little while. All right. Let's talk about the identity and inverse properties. Identity and inverse properties. Okay, identity and inverse property. So when you think of the word identity, think of the word identical. Identical. So there's identity property of addition and then the identity property of multiplication. So let's talk about the identity property of addition. So do this first. Identity property of addition. Right, so identity property of addition. So basically you're asking yourself, if I have the number 7 and I'm adding something to it, and I want to get that 7 back, so the identical number back. So 7 plus what will be identically 7? 0. Okay? So the identity property of addition says that any number plus 0 is that number. Okay? Same thing with the identity property of multiplication. So 7 times what will give me 7 back? 1. So the identity property of multiplication says that any number times 1 is itself. Any number times 1 is itself. Okay? right, so 0 is the only number you can add to a number and get itself back. 1 is the only number you can multiply a number by and get that number back. Okay? All right, now let's talk about additive inverse. All right, additive inverse. So another word for additive inverse is opposites. So think of the word opposite. So additive inverse, you're going to think of opposites. Okay? So put this number 1. The opposite, let's remember let's see if you remember how or what opposite means. The opposite of 4 is, what do you think? -4. So in terms of the number line, if this is 0 and this is 4, what is the opposite on the other side of 0? On the other side of 0, what is the opposite of that number 4 but having the same distance? -4. So the opposite of 4 is -4. The opposite of -7 is what? 7. Because -7 and 7 are on the opposite sides of 0, right? They're the same distance from 0 on opposite sides. But instead of using the word opposite, I could have used what word? Additive inverse. Additive inverse. So I could have said the additive inverse of 8 is what? -8. So they all mean the same thing, opposite, additive inverse. Now here's why they use the word additive though. Additive means to do what? Add them up. So when I add two numbers that are inverses of each other, let me be a little bit careful because there's also the multiplicative inverse. So I need to be careful. So I'm not going to use the word inverses. When I add two numbers that are additive inverses of each other, or the word opposite, so when you add two numbers that are opposites of each other, what do they add up to be? 0. Have to be 0. The identity, right? The sum is 0. Kind of makes sense because -8 plus 8 is what? 0. All right, so that's additive inverse. Additive inverse, what other word do you think of? Opposites. And when you add up two numbers that are additive inverses or opposites, they add to be 0. And we did some problems a while ago. Remember that, I don't see it real quickly, but that -16, +16, oh, it's right here. These two numbers were what? They were opposites, right? Y'all remember that? So a -16 to +16, they're opposites, they're additive inverses. So when I add them up, what do we get? 0. Okay. Now let's talk about multiplicative inverse. Very simple, not that difficult. Multiplicative inverse. All right, and then we'll stop at that point. So multiplicative inverse. Another word for multiplicative inverse is reciprocal. 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 So another word for additive inverse is what? Opposites. I got you. You thought you were thinking reciprocal. Another word for additive inverses is opposites. Another word for multiplicative inverse is what? Reciprocal. So let's see if you remember what a reciprocal is. The reciprocal of 2/3 is what? 3/2, right? Now don't make it negative. That's nothing to do with that. It's just like a reciprocal. The numerator becomes the denominator becomes the numerator. The multiplicative inverse of 1 1/8 is what? Remember, another word for multiplicative inverse is what? Reciprocal. Okay, they mean the same thing. So what's a multiplicative inverse of 1/8? 8/1, or you could have just said what? 8. Okay. The reciprocal of -2/9 is what? Okay, 9/-2, or you could have really said what? -2/9, where you put the negative out in front. Okay? All right. So the idea of reciprocal. So we're going to do a little bit more with this next class period. I think we're almost done with this. Now, I can't assign 8.6 yet because we still have about 10 minutes to do. But I can give you some worksheets to work on.
Okay, are we gonna go back to number 7?
Yeah, we're going to come back. So I'm glad you brought that up. We're going to come back to, you probably know it right away. So look, this was, make sure I wrote number 76 correct. Okay. We just talked about this property. What's this property right here? 1 times 9 same as 9. Look it up. No, not commutative. -1 times 9. If you say the commutative property, you have to say 9 times what? 1. So it's not the commutative property. The identity property of what? Multiplication. That's this one right here. The identity property of multiplication. 7 times 1 is just what? 7. No, commutative property says this. If it's 1 times 9, you have to say what? 9 times 1. That's commutative property. So the answer here is going to be the identity property of what? Multiplication. Okay, so let me just quickly tell you what worksheets I can give you. All right, so this is 8.6 part B. So here it just says to use a commutative property. We talked about something like this. Use an associative property. And remember the simplifying? You don't have to show any work on the simplifying, just give me the answer. Okay? So that's that one. Then, remember the distributive property? Y'all remember that? All I want in these blanks are the what? The answers. Don't do any work in the blank. What goes in the blank only? The answers. And it must all be done in what? Pencil. All right, so put the answers in the blank. Now, some of these you have to do the work somewhere else, right? But just give me the answers. Especially these right here. All right. And then, okay, that's about, I'm only going to give you B and C for right now. I can't give you A because we hadn't talked about all these properties yet. We talked about almost all of them except maybe 1 or 2. So I'm going to wait until next class period to give you part A. So I'm going to give you 2 worksheets, part B and part C. Okay?